The photograph that would eventually appear on every missing person poster across Cebu showed Jessica Monroe smiling at a beachside bar in Mactan, her sunburned shoulders draped in a floral sarong, her expression radiating the kind of carefree happiness that comes from believing yourself safe in a tropical paradise where turquoise waters and friendly locals promise escape from Seattle's gray skies and the painful memories of a relationship that had ended 3 months before she boarded the flight to Manila, never imagining that her decision to extend a 5-day wedding trip into a 3-month solo adventure would transform her from successful marketing consultant into international news headline that began with the words, "American woman found dead." The invitation to her college roommate Megan Carter's destination wedding in Cebu had arrived during the darkest period of Jessica's life, when her 6-year relationship with her longtime boyfriend had collapsed in a betrayal that left her questioning everything she thought she knew about trust and love and the future she had carefully planned, making the prospect of traveling halfway around the world to celebrate someone else's happiness feel simultaneously painful and necessary, like pressing on a bruise to confirm it still hurts. The 32-year-old marketing consultant had built a successful remote work career that gave her the flexibility to work from anywhere with reliable internet, a freedom she had never fully exploited during her years with her boyfriend, who preferred familiar routines and predictable vacations to the kind of adventurous travel that Jessica had always dreamed about but suppressed in favor of relationship, harmony, and shared domesticity. The decision to extend her stay in the Philippines beyond Megan's wedding was made impulsively during the reception itself, fueled by tropical cocktails and the intoxicating realization that she had no urgent reason to return to Seattle, where an empty apartment and well-meaning friends would force her to confront the loneliness and disappointment that travel temporarily allowed her to escape, creating dangerous vulnerability that made her susceptible to attention from strangers who recognized her neediness and exploited it for purposes she could never have anticipated. Marco Dela Cruz had approached Jessica at the wedding reception with the kind of smooth confidence that comes from years of targeting foreign women in Cebu's nightlife scene. His good looks and charming accent, disguising the desperate poverty of his childhood in a Manila slum and the violent tendencies that emerged whenever women tried to establish boundaries or end relationships that he viewed as validations of his worth and status in a society where dating Americans represented upward mobility and economic opportunity. The nightclub promoter's apparent interest in Jessica felt flattering and exciting to a woman whose recent heartbreak had damaged her confidence and made her question her attractiveness and desirability, his attention providing temporary relief from the pain of rejection, while also feeding into romanticized fantasies about exotic love affairs and the possibility of transforming travel adventure into meaningful connection with someone who seemed genuinely interested in her stories and experiences. What Jessica interpreted as Marco's genuine curiosity about American culture and his eagerness to show her authentic Filipino experiences was actually calculated manipulation by someone who had perfected techniques for making foreign women feel special and understood while systematically isolating them from safety networks and creating emotional dependencies that would later be exploited through control, intimidation, and ultimately violence when his targets attempted to reassert independence or end relationships that had become suffocating. The early weeks of their connection seemed innocent and thrilling, with Marco organizing beach trips to remote islands, introducing Jessica to local foods and hidden restaurants, and creating experiences that felt uniquely tailored to her desire for authentic cultural immersion rather than typical tourist activities. His apparent generosity, masking the financial calculations and status-seeking motivations that drove his pursuit of relationships with foreign women. The warning signs that Jessica missed or dismissed included Marco's intense jealousy when she spoke with other men, his insistence on knowing her location and schedule at all times, his gradually increasing criticism of her clothing choices and behavior, and his subtle isolation tactics that separated her from other travelers and limited her interactions with Megan and other wedding guests, who might have recognized the dangerous patterns developing in her relationship. The apartment that Marco convinced Jessica to rent in a less touristy neighborhood of Cebu represented a significant escalation in his control tactics. Moving her away from hotel environments where staff might notice concerning behaviors and into a location where he could monitor her movements more completely, while also creating the illusion of domestic partnership that justified his increasing presence in every aspect of her daily life. The financial entanglement that developed as Jessica paid for most of their activities and meals created additional complications, with Marco's apparent lack of resources making her feel both needed and guilty about her relative wealth, emotions that he skillfully manipulated to extract money, while also using her economic advantage as excuse for masculine insecurity and accusations about her perceived superiority that justified his controlling behaviors. The attempts by Megan to express concern about Jessica's relationship with Marco were dismissed as jealousy or cultural misunderstanding, her friends' warnings about his reputation in local nightlife circles rejected as unfair stereotyping of Filipino men, creating rifts in their friendship that further isolated Jessica from support systems that might have helped her recognize the danger she faced. The violence began with verbal abuse during arguments about Jessica's perceived flirtations with other men, Marco's accusations escalating from jealous comments to frightening rage that revealed the insecurity and need for control that had been carefully hidden during the courtship period, when charm and attention had been necessary to secure her trust and affection. The first physical assault occurred 6 weeks into their relationship, a shove during an argument that Marco immediately apologized for with tears and promises that it would never happen again. His apparent remorse and declarations of love convincing Jessica to forgive the incident as aberration, rather than recognizing it as preview of escalating violence that would ultimately cost her life. The pattern of abuse that developed followed predictable cycles of tension building, violent outbursts, and honeymoon periods where Marco became attentive and loving, his apologies and promises of change, creating hope that the relationship could return to the early excitement, while also generating shame and confusion that prevented Jessica from seeking help or ending the relationship before his violence reached lethal intensity. The involvement of Arnel Ramos as Marco's friend and enabler added another layer of danger to Jessica's situation, the bartender's loyalty to Marco overriding any moral concerns about the treatment of foreign women, his willingness to help create alibis and facilitate isolation tactics, demonstrating the social networks that supported intimate partner violence through silence and complicity. The final weeks of Jessica's life were marked by her attempts to end the relationship and arrange early return to Seattle, her recognition that she had made terrible mistake, conflicting with Marco's increasingly desperate efforts to prevent her departure through combinations of threats, emotional manipulation, and physical intimidation that trapped her in a situation where every exit strategy seemed blocked by his monitoring and control. The last confirmed sighting of Jessica Monroe alive occurred at a beachside restaurant in Mactan on the evening of September 15th, approximately 87 days after her arrival in the Philippines, and 3 days before her body would be discovered in a shallow grave in a coconut plantation 20 kilometers south of Cebu City. And her death, the result of blunt force trauma and strangulation that forensic pathologists would determine occurred within hours of that final meal, where witnesses observed her dining with Marco de la Cruz and appearing anxious and subdued. The text messages that Jessica sent to Megan during those final days revealed growing fear and desperation. Her attempts to communicate danger constrained by awareness that Marco was monitoring her phone and reading her communications, creating coded language and subtle warnings that her friend would later recognize as cries for help that went unheeded due to their ambiguous phrasing, and Jessica's apparent reluctance to explicitly state the severity of her situation. The timeline reconstruction by Philippine National Police. Investigators revealed that Jessica had purchased a plane ticket back to Seattle departing on September 20th. Her decision to leave communicated to Marco 3 days before her disappearance, triggering the violent rage and determination to prevent her departure that would ultimately lead to her murder in what prosecutors would characterize as intimate partner femicide, driven by masculine entitlement and refusal to accept rejection. The crime scene evidence suggested that Jessica had been killed elsewhere and transported to the coconut plantation burial site, with forensic analysis indicating that her death occurred in a location with concrete flooring and limited space, characteristics matching Marco's small apartment where blood traces would later be discovered, despite his attempts at cleaning and concealment. The initial missing person report filed by Megan on September 17th, when Jessica failed to answer calls or return to her apartment, revealed the bureaucratic challenges and investigative delays that complicated early search efforts, with local police initially treating the case as routine disappearance of foreign tourists who might have simply moved to another location without informing friends. Their skepticism reflecting unfortunate patterns where missing women were not taken seriously until bodies were discovered. The discovery of Jessica's body by a farmer on September 18th transformed the investigation from missing person case to homicide, mobilizing additional resources and investigative personnel, while also generating international media attention that brought pressure on Philippine authorities to demonstrate competence and commitment to solving crimes against foreign nationals who contributed significantly to tourism economy. The autopsy results revealed that Jessica had died from combination of blunt force trauma to the head and manual strangulation, her injuries consistent with sustained attack rather than single blow or brief struggle, indicating the rage and determination with which her killer had ended her life when she attempted to leave relationship that he viewed as possession rather than partnership between equals. The forensic evidence collected from Jessica's body included DNA material under her fingernails, suggesting she had fought against her attacker, defensive wounds on her arms indicating attempts to protect herself from blows, and patterned bruising consistent with being struck by fists and kicked while on the ground, painting picture of brutal assault that demonstrated the extreme violence underlying Marco's carefully cultivated, charming exterior. The investigation into Marco de la Cruz's background revealed disturbing pattern of violence against previous girlfriends, including 2 Filipino women who had filed restraining orders that were never seriously enforced, and 1 American tourist who had left the country abruptly after relationship that witnesses described as controlling and frightening, his history of intimate partner violence having been overlooked or minimized by authorities who failed to recognize his danger to women. The interview with Annalyn Cruz, Marco's former girlfriend, provided crucial insights into his psychological patterns and escalation tactics. Her description of his jealous rages and violent reactions to perceived rejection, corroborating the profile that investigators were developing of a man whose insecurity and need for control manifested in lethal violence when women attempted to assert independence or end relationships. The surveillance camera footage from various locations in Cebu helped reconstruct the final days of Jessica's life, showing her with Marco at bars and restaurants, where witnesses later reported observing arguments and his aggressive body language, creating visual record of relationship deterioration that supported prosecution theories about premeditated murder rather than spontaneous act of passion. The phone records analysis revealed that Marco had been calling and texting Jessica with increasing frequency during the days before her murder, his communications showing escalating possessiveness and threats regarding her planned departure, creating documentary evidence of his awareness that she intended to leave, and his determination to prevent her escape from relationship he viewed as validating his status and worth. The financial investigation into Marco's activities revealed that he had attempted to use Jessica's credit cards after her death, his purchases of clothing and electronics, demonstrating both his lack of remorse and his view of her as resource to be exploited even after her murder, his brazen theft adding financial crimes to the murder charges that prosecutors would eventually file. The arrest of Marco de la Cruz occurred 48 hours after the discovery of Jessica's body, executed by Philippine National Police officers who surrounded his apartment in the early morning hours, finding him sleeping beside the same woman he had begun dating within days of murdering Jessica. His ability to move on so quickly, revealing the shallow nature of his emotional attachments, and his view of women as interchangeable objects serving his needs, rather than human beings deserving respect and autonomy. Detective Ramon Villanueva's interrogation of Marco revealed a man who initially denied any involvement in Jessica's death, while simultaneously showing no genuine emotion about her murder, his affect flat and defensive. Rather than demonstrating the shock and grief that innocent partners typically display when learning that loved ones have been killed, his demeanor immediately raising investigator suspicions about his guilt. The breaking of Marco's alibi came through Arnel Ramos, whose initial loyalty to his friend deteriorated under police pressure, and mounting evidence of his own criminal liability as accomplice to murder and conspiracy to conceal crime. His eventual cooperation, providing detailed account of the events leading to Jessica's death and the subsequent disposal of her body in the coconut plantation. The confession that Arnel provided described how Marco had called him on the evening of September 15th, asking for help with a problem, arriving at Marco's apartment to find Jessica's body wrapped in bedsheets and Marco, in state of agitated panic that contrasted sharply with his usual confident demeanor, his request for assistance in disposing of the body, placing Arnell in position of choosing between loyalty to friend and legal consequences of participating in cover-up of homicide. The testimony about the burial revealed that the two men had transported Jessica's body in Arnell's motorcycle sidecar during late-night hours, selecting the coconut plantation due to its remoteness and presumed lack of surveillance, their shallow grave insufficient to conceal the crime for more than days, before discovery by farmer whose shock at finding foreign woman's body led to immediate police notification. The forensic evidence linking Marco to the murder included blood traces in his apartment that matched Jessica's DNA, cleaning supplies purchased on the night of the murder, suggesting attempted concealment of crime scene, and soil samples from his shoes matching the plantation location where body was buried, creating comprehensive physical evidence that corroborated Arnell's testimony and eliminated reasonable doubt about his guilt. The psychological evaluation of Marco, ordered by prosecution, revealed personality disorders, including narcissistic traits, inability to empathize with others' suffering, and tendency to view relationships as serving his needs rather than mutual partnerships requiring respect and compromise. His psychological profile consistent with research on intimate partner homicide perpetrators who kill when partners attempt to leave relationships they view as possessions. The investigation into Marco's financial motivations revealed that he had been supporting himself largely through money obtained from foreign girlfriends. His nightclub promoter work, providing minimal legitimate income, while relationships with American and European tourists offered access to resources and status that his impoverished background had denied him. Jessica, representing not only romantic conquest but economic opportunity whose departure threatened his lifestyle. The interviews with other foreign women who had dated Marco revealed consistent patterns of initial charm, followed by increasing control, jealousy, and in some cases physical violence. Their stories creating portrait of serial abuser who targeted vulnerable tourists, seeking authentic cultural experiences and romantic adventures, exploiting their loneliness and desire for connection to facilitate controlling relationships. The testimony from hotel staff and neighbors documented the escalating arguments between Jessica and Marco during the weeks before her murder, witnesses describing his aggressive behavior and her visible fear, creating record of relationship violence that had been observed by multiple people who did not intervene due to cultural norms against involvement in couples' private disputes or uncertainty about how to help foreign woman in dangerous situation. The digital forensics examination of Jessica's laptop revealed journal entries describing her fear of Marco and her plans to escape, her written accounts of his violence and threats, providing powerful evidence of his abusive behavior, while also documenting her growing recognition that she had become trapped in a relationship that threatened her safety and possibly her life. The investigation into local police handling of previous complaints against Marco revealed systemic failures in protecting women from intimate partner violence, with reports from Filipino girlfriends being minimized or ignored due to biases about domestic disputes being private matters and skepticism about women's credibility when accusing men of violence. Institutional failures that had allowed Marco to continue victimizing women despite multiple warnings about his dangerous behavior. The international cooperation between American and Philippine law enforcement agencies revealed the challenges of investigating crimes against American citizens abroad, with FBI involvement providing additional resources and pressure to ensure thorough investigation, while also highlighting jurisdictional complexities and cultural differences in approaches to domestic violence and women's safety that complicated prosecution efforts. The media coverage of the case sparked conversations in the Philippines about violence against women and the particular vulnerabilities faced by foreign tourists who lacked knowledge of local danger signs and safety resources, generating public debate about tourism, industry responsibilities, and social norms that tolerated or minimized intimate partner violence. The criminal trial of Marco de la Cruz began 6 months after Jessica's murder in a Cebu courtroom packed with international journalists, victim advocates, and local observers drawn to case that had become symbol of violence against women and the dangers faced by female tourists traveling alone in countries where gender-based violence was often tolerated or inadequately prosecuted by authorities. The prosecution's opening statement presented Marco as predatory individual who had deliberately targeted Jessica for her vulnerability and foreign status, systematically isolating her from support networks before murdering her when she attempted to end relationship and return to safety in America. His actions representing not crime of passion, but calculated intimate partner femicide driven by masculine entitlement and refusal to accept rejection from women he viewed as possession. The defense strategy attempted to characterize Jessica's murder as unintended result of argument that escalated beyond Marco's control, presenting him as man who loved her but lost emotional regulation during confrontation about her planned departure. Their narrative emphasizing his impoverished background and cultural context, while minimizing the pattern of violence and premeditation that prosecution evidence clearly demonstrated. The testimony of Megan Carter provided emotionally devastating account of her friend's deterioration during the relationship with Marco, describing Jessica's transformation from confident, independent woman into anxious, isolated person whose communications became increasingly constrained and whose apparent happiness masked growing fear. Megan's guilt about not recognizing the danger or intervening more forcefully, adding emotional weight to her factual descriptions. The forensic pathologist's testimony established that Jessica had survived for several minutes after the initial assault, her death resulting from combination of head trauma and strangulation that required sustained violence rather than single blow, the medical evidence contradicting defense claims about accidental death or momentary loss of control during argument. The presentation of Jessica's journal entries and text messages created powerful emotional impact in courtroom, her written words describing fear and entrapment, bringing her voice into proceedings and humanizing victim who could not testify about her own murder, the documentary evidence providing intimate view of psychological abuse and escalating violence that had characterized final weeks of her life. The testimony of Arnel Ramos as prosecution witness proved crucial despite his own criminal liability. His detailed account of receiving Marco's call for help, disposing of body, his description of Marco's demeanor and statements about killing Jessica because she thought she could just leave, and his cooperation in reconstructing the burial site providing evidence that established both guilt and consciousness of wrongdoing. The cross-examination of Arnel by defense attorneys attempted to undermine his credibility by emphasizing his own participation in concealing crime and suggesting his testimony was motivated by desire for reduced charges rather than truthfulness, though his account was substantially corroborated by physical evidence and other witness testimony that made his cooperation appear genuine rather than fabricated. The testimony of Annalyn Cruz about her own abusive relationship with Marco provided context for understanding his psychological patterns and tendency toward violence when women attempted to assert independence, her courage in testifying despite potential social stigma and fear of retaliation, demonstrating the importance of previous victims coming forward to establish patterns of behavior in intimate partner violence prosecutions. The expert testimony about intimate partner homicide patterns explained that killing of partners attempting to leave relationships represented well-documented phenomenon driven by perpetrator perceptions of ownership and masculine entitlement, contextualizing Jessica's murder within broader patterns of gender-based violence, while also refuting defense suggestions that her death was unique tragedy rather than predictable outcome of Marco's controlling and violent behavior. The digital evidence presentation included Marco's internet searches in days before murder, revealing research about body disposal and decomposition, demonstrating premeditation and consciousness of guilt, while undermining defense claims that Jessica's death resulted from argument that spontaneously escalated beyond his control, rather than representing calculated response to her planned departure. The financial evidence showing Marco's use of Jessica's credit cards after her murder provided additional proof of his guilt, while also revealing his lack of remorse and his view of her as resource to be exploited, his purchases of luxury items while her family mourned, demonstrating callousness that contradicted defense portrayal of him as loving partner, devastated by tragic accident. The testimony of local residents, describing Marco's reputation as someone who targeted foreign women for financial gain, undermined defense attempts to portray him as genuine romantic partner. Multiple witnesses describing his patterns of pursuing tourists and his boasting about relationships with American women, representing status symbols rather than authentic emotional connections. The closing arguments presented starkly different interpretations of the same evidence, with prosecution emphasizing the systematic nature of Marco's violence and his clear premeditation in murdering Jessica to prevent her departure, while defense maintained that cultural misunderstandings and momentary loss of control during emotional argument had produced unintended tragic outcome that deserved sympathy rather than harsh punishment. The jury deliberations extended over 2 days of intensive discussion about credibility, intent, and the cultural context surrounding the case. Their eventual unanimous verdict, reflecting acceptance of prosecution evidence that Marco had murdered Jessica in calculated act of intimate partner violence when she attempted to exercise her right to leave relationship that had become dangerous and suffocating. The verdict of guilty on charges of murder, kidnapping, and abuse of corpse was delivered on a humid afternoon in late March, the courtroom erupting in applause from victim advocates and angry protests from Marco's supporters, who viewed the prosecution as example of American imperialism, imposing foreign values on Philippine legal system. The polarized reactions, reflecting broader cultural tensions about gender, violence, and national sovereignty that had surrounded the case from its beginning. The sentencing phase revealed additional details about Marco's criminal history, including previous arrests for assault that had not resulted in convictions due to victims' reluctance to testify or pressure to drop charges, painting picture of serial offender whose violence had been enabled by systemic failures to hold him accountable for pattern of abuse that had escalated to murder. The victim impact statements from Jessica's family provided heartbreaking accounts of their loss, her mother's testimony about the daughter who had been adventurous and trusting, her father's anger about the man who had exploited those qualities to isolate and murder her, and her sister's description of the permanent void left by Jessica's absence, creating emotional weight that influenced the court's determination of appropriate punishment. The sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole represented the maximum punishment available under Philippine law. Judge Maria Santos's statement, emphasizing that Marco's actions represented particularly egregious example of intimate partner violence that exploited foreign woman's vulnerability while demonstrating complete disregard for human life and dignity. The sentencing of Arnel Ramos to 12 years imprisonment for accessory after the fact and conspiracy to conceal murder reflected his cooperation with prosecution, while also establishing accountability for his role in disposing of Jessica's body and attempting to help Marco avoid detection, his lesser sentence generating some controversy among those who viewed his participation as equally culpable as the murder itself. The immediate aftermath of the trial included celebrations by women's rights organizations, who viewed the conviction and harsh sentence as important victory in combating intimate partner violence and establishing that foreign tourists deserved equal protection under Philippine law, though some local commentators expressed concern about potential impacts on tourism and international perceptions of the country. The appeals process initiated by Marco's defense team focused on evidentiary issues and claims about cultural biases in jury selection and witness testimony, though legal experts generally agreed that the strength of prosecution evidence and the thoroughness of trial proceedings made successful appeal unlikely despite predictable attempts to challenge the conviction and sentence. The civil lawsuit filed by Jessica's family against Marco sought compensation for wrongful death, while also attempting to hold accountable any businesses or individuals who had facilitated his predatory behavior toward foreign women. The litigation revealing complex questions about institutional responsibilities and the extent to which nightlife establishments bore liability for violence committed by promoters and employees. The policy changes prompted by Jessica's murder included enhanced safety information for American tourists traveling to the Philippines, improved coordination between U.S. and Philippine authorities for investigating crimes against American citizens, and increased training for local police about intimate partner violence and the importance of taking early warning signs seriously before situations escalated to lethal violence. The impact on Cebu's tourism industry was mixed, with some decline in solo female travelers, expressing concerns about safety, while tourism organizations worked to emphasize that Jessica's murder was not representative of typical visitor experiences and that enhanced safety measures had been implemented to protect tourists from predatory individuals like Marco. The media analysis of the case examined how Jessica's nationality, race, and class status had influenced investigation and prosecution in ways that Filipino victims of intimate partner violence rarely experienced, creating uncomfortable conversations about disparities in justice system responses based on victim identity and international pressure rather than equal application of law to all cases of gender-based violence. The feminist critique of coverage emphasized how media narratives often focused on Jessica's decision to travel alone and extend her stay, rather than centering Marco's choice to commit violence. The tendency to question victim behavior, rather than perpetrator responsibility, reflecting broader patterns in how society discusses intimate partner violence and gender-based crimes. The examination of Marco's psychological profile in academic journals contributed to understanding of intimate partner homicide perpetrators who kill when partners attempt to leave, his case illustrating how masculine insecurity, economic desperation, and cultural norms about male authority combined to produce lethal violence when women asserted autonomy that threatened his identity and status. The support services for other foreign women who had experienced violence in the Philippines were expanded following publicity about Jessica's case, creating resources and reporting mechanisms that might help future victims escape dangerous relationships before suffering similar fates, transforming her tragedy into catalyst for positive systemic changes. The ongoing investigation into whether Marco had committed other crimes against tourists revealed several suspicious disappearances of foreign women in Cebu over previous years, though lack of bodies or clear evidence prevented determination of whether those cases involved his violence or represented unrelated tragedies, the uncertainty creating lasting questions about the full extent of his criminal activities. The 5-year anniversary of Jessica Monroe's murder prompted renewed media attention and retrospective analysis of how the case had influenced policies, practices, and cultural attitudes regarding intimate partner violence, tourist safety, and gender-based crimes in both the Philippines and the United States, revealing mixed progress toward meaningful change that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. The memorial scholarship established in Jessica's name supported young women pursuing careers in international development and cross-cultural understanding, transforming her death into opportunity for others, while honoring her adventurous spirit and genuine interest in experiencing different cultures. Though the bittersweet nature of the tribute could never truly compensate for the loss of her potential and the violence that had ended her life. The documentary film about Jessica's case attracted international attention through streaming platforms, generating renewed public interest in the dangers faced by solo female travelers, while also sparking debates about how to balance warnings about violence with encouragement of women's independence and right to explore the world without living in constant fear of male violence. The ongoing imprisonment of Marco Dela Cruz in maximum security facility outside Manila revealed his continued refusal to express genuine remorse for murdering Jessica. His letters and statements maintaining that her decision to leave him had provoked his violence in ways that somehow mitigated his responsibility, his unrepentant attitude confirming the narcissistic personality structure that had enabled his violence. The release of Arnel Ramos after serving 8 years of his 12-year sentence generated controversy among victim advocates who viewed his early parole as insufficient accountability for his role in concealing Jessica's murder. Though corrections officials emphasized his model behavior and genuine remorse as justification for reduced sentence, the disparity in punishment between perpetrator and accomplice, raising questions about proportionality in criminal justice system. The impact on Megan Carter included lasting guilt about bringing Jessica to the Philippines and not recognizing the danger she faced with Marco. Her therapy addressing the complex emotions surrounding her friend's murder, while helping her recognize that responsibility for violence rested solely with Marco rather than with victim or friends who could not have predicted his lethal escalation. The continued advocacy work by Jessica's family included lobbying for enhanced protections for American travelers abroad, improved training for consular officials responding to reports of missing or endangered citizens, and increased funding for prevention programs, addressing intimate partner violence in tourist destinations where foreign women faced particular vulnerabilities. The research initiatives examining Jessica's case contributed to enhanced understanding of how predatory individuals targeted tourists through exploitation of cultural differences, language barriers, and visitors' desire for authentic experiences, advancing knowledge about manipulation tactics and warning signs that might help future travelers recognize dangerous situations before becoming trapped in abusive relationships. The policy changes implemented by Philippine tourism authorities included mandatory training for nightlife workers about recognizing and reporting intimate partner violence, enhanced coordination with law enforcement for investigating suspicious situations involving foreign tourists, and public awareness campaigns warning visitors about predatory behavior disguised as romantic interest or cultural hospitality. The legal reforms inspired by Jessica's case included stronger penalties for intimate partner violence, improved protections for victims attempting to leave dangerous relationships, and enhanced enforcement of restraining orders that had previously been largely ignored by authorities who viewed domestic disputes as private matters, not requiring police intervention. The cultural conversations about masculinity and violence that Jessica's murder prompted included difficult examinations of how economic inequality and limited opportunities for poor men created psychological vulnerabilities that manifested in violence against women who represented status and resources, though these structural explanations could not excuse Marco's choice to murder rather than accept rejection. The impact on solo female travel patterns revealed complicated dynamics, with some women becoming more cautious about extended stays in developing countries, while others insisted on their right to travel independently without allowing fear of violence to restrict their freedom, creating ongoing debates about risk assessment and women's autonomy in deciding their own safety boundaries. The ongoing monitoring of intimate partner violence statistics in the Philippines revealed that Jessica's case had generated temporary increase in reporting and prosecutions, but that systemic changes remained incomplete, with many Filipino women still facing violence without adequate legal protection or social support, highlighting how foreign victim status had mobilized resources and attention that domestic victims rarely received. The psychological research examining why women like Jessica missed or dismissed warning signs of Marco's dangerous behavior revealed complex factors including recent heartbreak affecting judgment, cultural romanticization of foreign romance, and sophisticated manipulation tactics by experienced predators who understood how to exploit vulnerabilities while appearing charming and genuine during initial relationship phases. The 10th anniversary of Jessica's murder found her family still struggling with grief, while also acknowledging the meaningful advocacy work and policy changes that had emerged from their determination to transform tragedy into protection for other potential victims. Their ongoing efforts, ensuring that Jessica's death would be remembered not only as cautionary tale, but as catalyst for important systemic improvements in how intimate partner violence was prevented and prosecuted. The aging of Marco Dela Cruz in prison revealed his continued manipulation of institutional systems, his attempts to portray himself as reformed and deserving of clemency, despite lack of genuine remorse, and his letters to parole boards, emphasizing his impoverished background and cultural context, while minimizing his calculated violence and predatory targeting of vulnerable women. The establishment of the Jessica Monroe Foundation created permanent institution dedicated to supporting solo female travelers, funding safety education, providing emergency resources for women in dangerous situations abroad, and advocating for enhanced protections and support services that might prevent other families from experiencing similar devastating losses. The research publications examining intimate partner homicide of tourists contributed to enhanced understanding of how perpetrators like Marco specifically targeted foreign women for combinations of financial gain, status seeking, and the belief that victims' temporary presence would complicate investigation and prosecution, advancing knowledge about prevention strategies and warning signs that travelers should recognize. The international cooperation frameworks developed partially in response to Jessica's case improved coordination between American and Philippine authorities for investigating crimes against tourists, establishing protocols and relationships that facilitated more effective responses to missing person reports and suspicious situations that might indicate intimate partner violence. The cultural impact within the Philippines included ongoing conversations about gender-based violence, with younger generations increasingly rejecting traditional attitudes that minimized intimate partner abuse or blamed women for men's violence, creating gradual shifts in social norms that might eventually produce meaningful reductions in the epidemic of violence against women. The technological innovations in traveler safety included mobile applications providing emergency contacts, location tracking for trusted contacts, and educational resources about recognizing dangerous situations, with several apps specifically citing Jessica's case as motivation for developing tools that might help women in similar circumstances access help before violence escalated to murder. The ongoing support for Annalyn Cruz and other women who had survived abusive relationships with Marco included therapy, economic assistance, and advocacy training that transformed them from victims into powerful voices for change. Their willingness to speak publicly about their experiences, helping to reduce stigma and encourage other women to seek help when facing intimate partner violence. The legal precedents established through Marco's prosecution influenced subsequent cases involving violence against tourists, creating clearer frameworks for establishing jurisdiction, coordinating international investigations, and ensuring that perpetrators faced serious consequences regardless of victims' nationality or the challenges of prosecuting crimes that crossed international boundaries. The memorial events organized annually in both Seattle and Cebu honored Jessica's memory, while also providing opportunities for education about intimate partner violence and solo travel safety. The commemorations balancing grief with determination to prevent other families from suffering similar losses through awareness and systemic change. The policy advocacy addressing economic inequality and limited opportunities for young men in developing countries examined how structural factors created environments where predatory behavior toward wealthier tourists became survival strategy for desperate individuals, though these analyses carefully emphasize that poverty never excused violence and that understanding root causes must not translate into minimizing perpetrator accountability. The feminist analysis of travel safety discourse critiqued how warnings about violence often restricted women's freedom rather than addressing male violence as root problem, advocating for approaches that centered perpetrator behavior and systemic failures, while supporting women's right to travel independently without constant fear or unreasonable restrictions on their autonomy and adventurous spirit. The ongoing investigation into whether Marco had committed other murders remained inconclusive, despite persistent efforts to link him to several unsolved disappearances of foreign women in Cebu. The lack of bodies or definitive evidence preventing prosecution, while also leaving haunting questions about the full extent of his violence during years of targeting vulnerable tourists. The impact on Jessica's family relationships included both strengthening of bonds through shared grief and advocacy work, and also strains from different processing styles and disagreements about how best to honor her memory. The complex dynamics illustrating how tragedy affects families in varied ways that require ongoing communication and mutual support. The 15th anniversary of Jessica Monroe's murder marked a significant milestone in assessing long-term impacts of her case across multiple dimensions, including policy changes, cultural shifts, advocacy achievements, and the ongoing imprisonment of Marco Dela Cruz, whose continued refusal to accept responsibility for his violence demonstrated the intractable nature of his personality disorders and the appropriateness of life sentence that permanently removed him from society. The publication of a comprehensive book about Jessica's case by investigative journalist combined detailed examination of the crime with broader analysis of violence against female travelers, gender-based violence in the Philippines, and the systemic failures that had enabled Marco's predatory behavior, the work receiving critical acclaim while also generating renewed public discussion about how to balance travel freedom with realistic safety awareness. The International Conference on Tourist Safety, organized by the Jessica Monroe Foundation, brought together experts from law enforcement, psychology, women's rights organizations, and tourism industry to share knowledge about preventing violence against travelers, while also developing best practices for supporting victims and prosecuting perpetrators who targeted vulnerable foreign visitors. The ongoing research into intimate partner femicide examined how Jessica's case illustrated broader patterns where women were killed for asserting autonomy and attempting to leave controlling relationships, her murder representing not isolated tragedy, but predictable outcome of masculine entitlement and societal tolerance for men's violence against women who refused to submit to domination. The cultural evolution and discussions about solo female travel reflected growing recognition that warnings about danger often serve to restrict women's freedom rather than addressing male violence as core problem, creating movement toward approaches that educated women about manipulation tactics and red flags, while also demanding accountability from men and institutions that enabled or tolerated predatory behavior. The impact on Marco's family included complex grief and shame about his crimes, his mother's death several years earlier having been hastened by stress and heartbreak over her son's transformation from charming young man into convicted murderer. The family tragedy, extending beyond victims to include perpetrators' relatives who struggled with their own losses and betrayals. The prison conditions that Marco had experienced over 15 years reflected the harsh realities of Philippine maximum security facilities, with overcrowding, violence, and limited rehabilitation programming, creating environments that reinforced criminal identities rather than promoting genuine reform, though his disciplined personality allowed him better adaptation than many inmates who struggled with institutional brutality and deprivation. The parole hearing that Marco attended after 15 years resulted in unanimous denial based on his continued lack of remorse, his minimization of responsibility for Jessica's murder, and psychological evaluations, indicating that he remained dangerous to women and would likely reoffend if released. The board's decision affirming that life sentence meant exactly that, regardless of time served or superficial compliance with prison rules. The advocacy work by Jessica's family had influenced legislation in multiple countries regarding traveler safety, intimate partner, violence prevention, and international cooperation for investigating crimes against tourists, their tireless efforts transforming personal tragedy into meaningful policy changes that would protect countless other potential victims from predatory individuals who targeted vulnerable travelers. The educational programs developed by the Jessica Monroe Foundation reached thousands of solo travelers through online resources, safety workshops, and partnerships with travel companies, providing practical information about recognizing manipulation tactics, establishing safety protocols, and accessing help when situations became dangerous. The comprehensive approach, balancing empowerment with realistic risk awareness. The ongoing psychological research, examining why women stayed in dangerous relationships despite warning signs, contributed to enhanced understanding of trauma bonding, manipulation tactics, and the cognitive distortions that perpetrators created through cycles of abuse and intermittent reinforcement, advancing clinical knowledge that improved therapeutic interventions for survivors and prevention education for potential victims. The cultural legacy of Jessica's case extended beyond specific policy changes to include broader conversations about gender-based violence, masculine entitlement, and the social structures that enabled men's violence against women, her story becoming reference point in discussions about how to create societies where women could live freely without constant threat of male violence. The memorial garden established in Seattle's Discovery Park provided space for reflection and remembrance, the peaceful setting honoring Jessica's love of nature and adventure, while also serving as reminder of the violence that had ended her life, and the physical memorial, ensuring that her story would continue to be told to future generations who might learn from her tragedy. The 20th anniversary of Jessica Monroe's murder found Marco Dela Cruz at age 56, his life permanently defined by violence he committed at 36, his remaining decades destined to be spent in prison, where his continued refusal to accept responsibility demonstrated that some perpetrators never developed genuine insight or remorse regardless of time or consequences, their rigid personality structures preventing the kind of psychological growth that might produce authentic rehabilitation. The comprehensive evaluation of policy changes inspired by Jessica's case revealed mixed results, with meaningful improvements in some areas, including enhanced consular support for endangered travelers, better coordination between international law enforcement agencies, and increased public awareness about intimate partner violence warning signs, while other systemic issues including gender-based violence rates and judicial system inadequacies showed limited progress despite decades of advocacy efforts. The generational impact on both families included younger relatives who knew Jessica only through stories and photographs, their understanding of her filtered through family narratives that balanced honest acknowledgement of her poor judgment in trusting Marco with celebration of her adventurous spirit and genuine desire for cross-cultural connection, creating complex legacy that resisted simple moral lessons about women's behavior or travel safety. The academic literature examining Jessica's case had expanded across multiple disciplines, including criminology, psychology, gender studies, and tourism research, each field finding different insights in the intersection of factors that had produced her murder, from Marco's personality disorders and economic desperation, to cultural norms about masculinity and gender relations, to tourism industry practices that prioritized profit over visitor safety. The ongoing support network for other women who had survived abusive relationships with predatory men in tourist destinations created community among survivors who understood the particular shame and confusion of being targeted while traveling, their shared experiences generating insights about manipulation tactics and recovery processes, while also providing emotional validation that reduced isolation and self-blame. The technological advances in traveler safety had incorporated lessons from Jessica's case, with improved emergency response systems, better location tracking capabilities, and enhanced verification of local contacts who might pose dangers to visitors. Though privacy concerns and practical limitations meant that technology alone could never fully protect travelers from violence by determined perpetrators. The feminist analysis of how Jessica's case had been discussed and represented in media revealed persistent patterns of victim blaming and focus on her decisions rather than Marco's violence. The tendency to question why she had traveled alone or extended her stay rather than centering his choice to commit murder, reflecting broader cultural problems with how society discusses violence against women. The impact on Cebu's tourism industry had largely recovered from immediate aftermath of Jessica's murder, though destination maintained somewhat reduced appeal for solo female travelers who expressed ongoing concerns about safety, the reputational damage serving as reminder to tourism-dependent economies that protecting visitors from violence represented not only moral obligation, but economic necessity. The legislative achievements inspired by advocacy following Jessica's death included enhanced penalties for violence against tourists, improved victim support services, mandatory safety training for tourism workers, and strengthened international cooperation frameworks for investigating crimes against foreign nationals. The comprehensive policy changes representing meaningful progress even as implementation challenges and ongoing violence demonstrated that legal reforms alone could not eliminate gender-based violence. The prison reform debates that occasionally referenced Marco's case raised questions about whether life sentences without parole served legitimate penological purposes or represented purely retributive justice that offered no benefits beyond satisfying desires for vengeance. Though victim advocates consistently argued that intimate partner murderers, like Marco, posed ongoing dangers that justified permanent incapacitation, regardless of philosophical debates about punishment purposes, the ongoing investigation into other potential victims of Marco remained active despite passage of 20 years, with cold case detectives periodically reviewing unsolved disappearances of foreign women in Cebu during the years before Jessica's murder. The haunting possibility that he had killed others, creating lasting questions that might never be definitively answered due to lack of evidence or bodies. The relationship that Jessica's parents maintained with Megan, despite initial complicated feelings about her role in bringing Jessica to the Philippines, had evolved into genuine friendship based on shared love for Jessica and commitment to honoring her memory through advocacy work. Their reconciliation demonstrating how tragedy could sometimes strengthen, rather than destroy relationships among survivors who chose forgiveness and forward focus over blame and resentment. The cultural conversations about arranged relationships versus romantic love that Jessica's case prompted included examination of how both traditional and modern approaches to partnership could create vulnerabilities to violence, with arranged marriages potentially trapping women with abusive men while romantic relationships could blind women to danger through intensity of initial attraction, the nuanced analysis resisting simple conclusions about which approach better protected women from violence. The memorial scholarship recipients who had benefited from funding established in Jessica's name numbered over 100 young women pursuing international development and cross-cultural studies, their achievements representing the positive legacy that her family had created from tragedy, transforming her death into opportunities for others to pursue the kind of meaningful cross-cultural engagement that she had sought. The documentary updates and anniversary specials that continued to examine Jessica's case generated renewed interest in intimate partner violence and traveler safety, each retelling reaching new audiences who might learn from her story, while also keeping pressure on authorities to maintain focus on preventing and prosecuting violence against women, even as media attention naturally shifted to newer tragedies. 25 years after Jessica Monroe traveled to the Philippines to celebrate her friend's wedding and never returned home alive, her story continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the deadly intersection between masculine entitlement, economic desperation, cultural factors that tolerate violence against women, and the particular vulnerabilities faced by travelers who trust too quickly in environments where they lack knowledge of local danger signs and access to familiar support systems that might help them recognize and escape dangerous relationships before violence reaches lethal intensity. The Jessica Monroe Foundation has become an internationally recognized institution that has directly assisted over 3,000 travelers in dangerous situations, while also funding research, educational programs, and policy advocacy that have contributed to measurable improvements in how violence against tourists is prevented, investigated, and prosecuted across multiple countries and cultural contexts, where gender-based violence remains epidemic despite decades of activism and legal reforms. The legislative and policy changes inspired by advocacy following Jessica's murder include enhanced safety requirements for tourism industries, improved consular services for endangered travelers, strengthened international cooperation for investigating crimes against foreign nationals, and increased funding for intimate partner violence prevention programs that address cultural factors and economic inequalities that create environments where predatory behavior toward women is tolerated or inadequately punished by authorities. The ongoing imprisonment of Marco Dela Cruz represents permanent consequence of his choice to murder Jessica rather than accept her autonomy and right to leave relationship that had become dangerous, and his life sentence without parole, ensuring that he will die in prison regardless of any superficial rehabilitation or institutional adaptation. The criminal justice system's determination that intimate partner murderers deserve permanent removal from society where they pose continuing dangers to women. The cultural legacy of Jessica's case extends beyond specific policy achievements to include broader shifts in how societies discuss violence against women, with growing recognition that victim behavior should never be focal point of conversations about gender-based violence, and that preventing such crimes requires addressing perpetrator choices and social structures that enable masculine entitlement rather than restricting women's freedom or blaming them for trusting men who deliberately deceive and manipulate them. The memorial sites and scholarship programs established in Jessica's name ensure that her adventurous spirit and genuine desire for cross-cultural connection will be remembered alongside the tragedy of her murder, creating lasting positive impact that transforms her death into opportunities for others while honoring the person she was, rather than reducing her to cautionary tale about women's behavior or travel risks. The family healing that has occurred over 25 years demonstrates that recovery from traumatic loss never means forgetting or minimizing tragedy, but rather finding ways to carry grief while also creating meaning through advocacy, supporting others, and maintaining connections with people who shared love for victim, the ongoing process requiring sustained effort and commitment that Jessica's family has maintained, despite inevitable moments of exhaustion and despair. The story of Jessica Monroe serves as permanent reminder that while travel and cross-cultural connection represent valuable human experiences worth pursuing despite risks, women must remain vigilant about manipulation tactics employed by predatory men who target vulnerable travelers. Trust their instincts when situations feel dangerous, maintain connections with support networks who can provide objective perspectives on concerning relationship dynamics, and remember that prioritizing safety over politeness or romance can literally save lives in situations where charming exteriors mask violent intentions.